Hey guys, tonight we're talking about a drug with a 6-minute duration, zero euphoria, and somehow the most devoted following in psychedelic history. No warmth, no glow, no sense that the universe is rooting for you. It doesn't make the music sound better, or the room feel friendlier, or the people around you seem more interesting than they actually are. It just removes you completely, briefly. Like someone filed a noise complaint against your entire personality and had it escorted from the building. You're gone. Something else is in the chair. 6 minutes later you're back, slightly damp, deeply confused, with absolutely nothing useful to say about where you went. Most people try it once, sit with the experience for a long quiet moment, and then decide that once was exactly the right number of times. Tonight we're tracing how one ceremonial plant became the most extreme 6 minutes on the internet, and why something built for ritual turned out to be the one thing nobody could stay in. But before we get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're lying right now, perhaps tucked under a blanket halfway between curiosity and sleep. Now dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Here's what nobody understands about Salvia. You can't prepare for it. The part of you that prepares is the part that won't be there. And at some point you decide that's still not enough to stop you. So you sit down, lighter in one hand, extract in the other. You press the extract into the bowl. Dark, bitter smelling, like crushed leaves that learned bad manners. Someone says hold it in. Someone says don't worry. Which is about as useful as hearing stay calm on a plane that has started making new sounds. You inhale. For 1 second, nothing. Then your face lets go of something. Your cheeks, your lips, your forehead. It all starts slipping sideways as if your features are no longer fully committed to the arrangement, like something that was always held together by assumption, and the assumption just quietly lapsed. Your face is still there. It just doesn't feel like yours anymore. Then the room changes. The walls start showing their layers, not depth. Layers. Like reality is made of pages stacked on top of each other, and someone has started peeling them back. The wall isn't one thing anymore. It's several things arranged carefully, and you can see the arrangement. And then the part of you that says, I, gets pulled sideways. Like reality has seams and someone just found yours. You're not a person anymore. You're an object. A chair, a wall, a patch of floor. Something solid and purposeless and completely at peace with that. You realize you are not alone here. Something is present. The way gravity is present. The way time is present. Something that has always been on the other side of the door and is completely unsurprised that you finally knocked. And the whole time this is happening, time itself is doing something strange. Time doesn't slow down. It loses its shape. There is no before, no after. Just this, whatever this is, with no sense of how long it has been happening or when it will stop. And the strangest part is that it all feels correct. Not frightening, correct. Like this was always how it was supposed to be, and your life before it was the part that never made sense. Then, just as suddenly, the 6 minutes end. Your hands return like borrowed items. Your friend is saying your name, like they're not entirely sure you're the same person who went in. Your body looks fine, your face disagrees. Then you laugh, uncontrollably, the kind that has nothing to do with funny, that comes from somewhere much deeper than funny. Somewhere that doesn't have a name, and in the midst of that you're also talking about something that made complete sense 6 minutes ago, and will never make sense again. Most people do it once, put the pipe down, and spend the next few days not quite finding the words. Not because it was bad, because it was the most real thing that ever happened to them, and nobody has built the words for it yet. Some people do it again and again, chasing something they left on the other side of the door. Not the high, there is no high. What they're chasing is the certainty, that feeling for 6 minutes, that everything made sense, that this was always the truth. They want to live in that sentence a little longer. Someone centuries ago felt the same thing and built an entire system around it. It starts in the mountains of Mexico, with a plant that had been growing quietly in one valley for centuries before anyone outside that valley knew it existed, tended by healers who understood what it required, passed from hand to hand the way knowledge is passed when you have no intention of writing it down. The system had one purpose: open the door deliberately, carefully, with the right preparation and the right person leading the way. They called it the velada, a night vigil that began after midnight, in a darkness so deliberate it was almost its own instruction. The healer would chew the fresh leaves slowly over the course of an hour, letting the plant work through the mouth at its own pace, no rushing. The Mazatec understood something the rest of the world would spend centuries failing to grasp: that this particular door opens on its own schedule, and forcing it is not a strategy, it's an announcement that you haven't been paying attention. The plant had a name, the shepherdess, which should tell you something about the relationship. You don't take the shepherdess, you visit her. The healer was looking for something, the cause of an illness, the location of something lost, an answer that ordinary life couldn't reach. She went in to find it. She came back, sometimes with exactly what was needed. The tradition survived for centuries, which is more than you can say for most pharmaceutical interventions. For centuries, nobody outside that valley knew this plant existed, not because it was hidden exactly, but because it couldn't leave. Salvia divinorum is arguably the most unusual psychedelic plant on Earth, not because of what it does, but because of what it can't do. It almost never flowers. When it does flower, it almost never produces viable seeds. It spreads only by cuttings, one plant propagating from another. Every salvia plant outside Mexico is descended from a cutting of a cutting of a cutting, brought out by human hands. No seeds, no wind dispersal, no birds carrying it across the forest. The entire global population of Salvia divinorum is genetically almost identical. Clonal descendants of a handful of specimens, the botanical equivalent of someone who has never left their hometown and has actively made peace with that. And the Mazatec were not advertising its location. For decades they actively concealed it from European botanists who came looking. The man who found it had already made one very large mistake. His name was R. Gordon Wasson, American banker, amateur mycologist, and the kind of person who takes a very niche hobby and somehow turns it into a global cultural event, which, depending on your perspective, makes him either a visionary or a cautionary tale with a press pass. In 1957, he published an article in Life magazine called Seeking the Magic Mushroom. Millions of readers opened it to find a photograph of a Mazatec healer named Maria Sabina, holding mushrooms in a ceremony that was supposed to be private. The article introduced psilocybin mushrooms to the Western world and accidentally launched the psychedelic era. It also destroyed Maria Sabina's life. Tourists arrived, not a few curious scholars, thousands, seekers, journalists, hippies, beatniks, the merely curious, and eventually Timothy Leary, all of them following Wasson's published directions to the same mountain village in Oaxaca, all of them wanting the same ceremony, all of them treating a sacred healing ritual as a tourist attraction with a spiritual theme. The Mazatec community held Maria Sabina responsible. Her house was burned down. She was ostracized by the people she'd healed for decades. She spent her final years in poverty, occasionally interviewed by journalists who wanted her opinion on the hippies, which was not printable. The woman who opened the door for the West was left outside it. Wasson knew what had happened. He spent years writing about it, apologizing for it, explaining that he hadn't meant for any of it, which is true, and also completely beside the point. In 1962, he went back to Oaxaca, not for mushrooms this time. There was another plant he'd been hearing about, Something quieter, something the Mazatec used in ceremonies even more private than the ones he'd already exposed. This time he brought someone with him, the one person he thought could figure out what they were dealing with. He didn't publish the location. He had learned that lesson. The person he brought with him was Albert Hofmann. In 1943, while resynthesizing a compound he'd set aside years earlier, Hofmann had accidentally touched it to his skin and spent the next several hours watching reality perform tricks he hadn't known were possible. He named the compound LSD and spent the rest of his career trying to understand what he'd created. He was the most qualified person alive to look at this plant. In 1962, he didn't just receive specimens in a laboratory. He went to the Sierra Mazateca himself, attended ceremonies, met the healers directly, sat in a velada. Chewed 26 fresh leaves in darkness in the mountains of Mexico, which is a methodical self-experiment conducted by the man who had accidentally invented LSD while touching his face at work. He experienced what he later described as a not unpleasant twilight state. No geometry, no cosmic dissolution, just a quiet, strange softening of things. He brought specimens back to Basel, ran his tests, found nothing he recognized. No known compound, no pathway he understood, nothing that matched LSD, psilocybin, or anything else in the existing literature. He tried different extraction methods, different solvents, different approaches. The compound refused to reveal itself. For the man who had identified psilocybin and synthesized LSD, this was not a familiar feeling. He spent years on it, failed. The inventor of LSD stumped by a plant. In the meantime, the plant got a name, Salvia divinorum, sage of the diviners. It sounds like a password, like something you'd whisper to get through a very specific kind of door. Except the Latin is slightly wrong. Divinorum means ghosts, not diviners. Someone at Harvard made a small error and nobody caught it. The most powerful natural psychedelic on Earth is named officially after ghosts, by accident. It would not be the last time someone got this plant slightly wrong. After Wasson and Hofmann, nothing happened for a very long time. The specimens sat in botanical collections. Trip reports circulated in circles so small they barely constituted a circle. Then Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs. This is relevant because the war on drugs didn't just target drug users, it targeted drug researchers. The government classified psychedelic compounds as Schedule 1, which meant no accepted medical use, high abuse potential, and research essentially impossible. Scientists who'd spent years producing genuinely extraordinary findings suddenly found their funding gone, their licenses revoked, their careers quietly ended. Not because the science was bad, because the politics were. By the late 1960s, researchers had completed over 1,000 clinical studies on psychedelic compounds. LSD was showing results in treating alcoholism that no existing treatment had come close to. Psilocybin was reducing end-of-life anxiety in terminal patients. The science was young, strange, and genuinely promising. None of it mattered. The Schedule 1 classification ended it. Not slowed it, ended it. Before any of it could become medicine, the patients went without. The questions went unanswered. An entire generation of scientists learned this was not a safe area to work in. The most unusual psychedelic on Earth sat in a drawer for 20 years. The shepherdess, meanwhile, stayed exactly where she'd always been. One valley, one mountain range, tended by the same people who had always tended her, unbothered by the war being fought in her name by people who had never heard of her. One graduate student couldn't let it go. His name was Leander Valdez, not famous, not well-funded. The kind of researcher who picks a problem everyone else has given up on and decides, for reasons impossible to explain at a dinner party, that he's going to be the one to solve it. He had read everything Wasson and Hofmann had published. He had tried the plant himself, chewing fresh leaves in darkness, the way the Mazatec had always done it. He knew something extraordinary was in those leaves, and he found that intolerable. So he ran the tests nobody else had bothered to run, built his own extraction protocols from scratch, got close, hit dead ends, started over. Published preliminary findings that almost nobody read in journals with readership so small you could fit the entire audience in a medium-sized living room with chairs to spare. The ethnobotanical community noticed. A young researcher named Daniel Siebert read everything Valdez published and started his own investigation. The circle of people who cared about this plant grew from roughly 4 to roughly 6. Progress. Siebert would turn out to be important, not because he cracked the chemistry, others were doing that, but because he figured out something no one else had thought to try. He established that smoking the dried leaves worked. The Mazatec had always chewed fresh leaves, delivering the compound slowly through the mouth. Smoking delivered it all at once, directly to the lungs. Completely different experience, completely different intensity. The Mazatec's method was, it turned out, a form of harm reduction, not because they knew the pharmacology, but because they knew the plant. Smoking bypassed everything they had built around it. Siebert published his findings. Then he started selling Salvia online, legally, because nobody had thought to make it illegal yet. Then, in 1982, a separate research team found it. A chemist named Ortega and his colleagues isolated the active compound, named it Salvinorin A, and published the structure. Valdez, working in parallel, confirmed the finding shortly after. Between them, they had cracked what Hoffman couldn't, and the structure was wrong. Not wrong as in incorrect. Wrong as in impossible. Every psychedelic ever studied had one thing in common: nitrogen, alkaloids, the class that includes every hallucinogen ever discovered, from LSD to psilocybin to mescaline to DMT, all contain nitrogen. It's the chemical signature, the thing you look for, the thing that tells you what you're dealing with. If you find a compound that produces psychedelic effects, it contains nitrogen. This was not a theory. It was an observation so consistent across so many compounds over so many decades that it had effectively become a rule. Salvinorin A contains no nitrogen. Not a little, none. It's a completely different class of molecule, the kind found in plant resins and essential oils, the kind that is not supposed to do anything interesting to the human nervous system, and yet here it was, the most potent, naturally occurring psychedelic known to science, producing experiences that the greatest psychedelic chemist alive had described as unlike anything in the existing literature, built from a molecule that had no business being psychoactive at all. The rulebook said this was impossible. The rulebook was wrong. Scientists looked at the structure and said, this doesn't make sense. Then they said it again. Then they went back to their own work, because 1982 was not a year when powerful new psychedelic with an impossible chemical structure was something anyone in research wanted to be associated with. The compound sat there, identified but unexplained, in the pages of a journal that almost nobody read. For another 20 years. The person who figured it out wasn't a psychedelic researcher at all. His name was Brian Roth, a pharmacologist at Case Western Reserve University, the kind of scientist who looks at an unsolved problem the way a dog looks at a locked gate, with the quiet, implacable certainty that there is a way through and he is going to find it. In 2002, he figured out how Salvinorin A works. It targets kappa opioid receptors, not serotonin, not dopamine, not any of the pathways that psychedelic researchers had spent decades mapping. A completely different system, one associated not with mystical experiences but with dysphoria, stress response, and addiction. Two fields that had never spoken to each other suddenly shared a compound. The psychedelic researchers and the addiction researchers, both staring at the same molecule from completely different directions, neither quite believing what they were looking at. Kappa opioid receptors had been studied for years as potential targets for depression, chronic pain, and addiction treatment, specifically for reducing craving in cocaine and opioid users without creating new dependency. What the research needed was a powerful selective compound to study the system properly. It had been sitting in a valley in Mexico the whole time. Not addictive. Kappa opioid receptors don't trigger the brain's reward pathway. No known lethal dose. Short-acting and controllable. Active at doses so small they could barely be measured. Opioid addiction was claiming tens of thousands of lives a year. Cocaine addiction had no effective pharmaceutical treatment. Depression was being managed with blunt instruments that worked for some people, some of the time, with side effects that drove half of them to stop taking the medication. And sitting in a mountain valley in Mexico, tended by healers who'd been using it carefully for centuries, was a compound that potentially addressed all three. Nobody had asked them about it. Not once. Not Hoffman. Not Valdez. Not Roth. The people with centuries of accumulated knowledge about what this plant was and what it required were completely absent from every conversation about what to do with it. This pattern, it turned out, would continue. The first people to find it online were not teenagers looking for a legal high. They were the kind of people who had been cataloguing obscure psychoactive plants since before most of the internet existed. Forum dwellers, ethnobotany enthusiasts, the self-appointed archivists of every strange substance humanity had ever ingested. They found salvia the same way they found everything, by reading papers nobody else read, asking questions nobody else was asking, and then ordering whatever arrived in an unmarked package and writing very detailed reports about what happened next. Erowid started collecting trip reports, and they were unlike anything else in the archive. Users described experiences that didn't fit any existing framework, not like LSD, not like mushrooms, not like anything that had a name. The reports were vivid, confused, occasionally terrifying, and impossible to stop reading. The forums filled up. Head shops started stocking it. Siebert's online store was shipping to addresses in 40 states. The internet had heard there was a legal plant you could buy at a head shop that would send you somewhere else for 6 minutes. And the internet had a camera and a comment section. The shepherdess had been waiting patiently for centuries. She was about to meet an audience that had no idea who she was, no interest in finding out, and absolutely no intention of sitting in darkness and waiting to be received. This is how it went. The first Salvia video that went properly viral was not impressive production. No lighting rig, no editing, no music. Just a teenager in a bedroom chair, a pipe, a lighter, and a friend off camera saying, "You ready?" in the tone of someone who has absolutely no qualifications to be supervising anything involving human brain. The teenager takes the hit, holds it. 6 seconds pass. Then they go somewhere else. Not dramatically, not violently. They just stop. The eyes stay open, but nobody is home. The body stays upright out of habit, like a building that hasn't been told yet that it's been condemned. One hand reaches for something that isn't there. The mouth forms a word that isn't a word. The head tilts at an angle that suggests a profound renegotiation with the concept of walls. 6 minutes later, they're back, laughing. Not at anything, just laughing. The kind that has no joke behind it and doesn't need one. Trying to say something, failing, trying again. Looking at the camera with the expression of someone who has just returned from a country that doesn't issue visas and isn't sure how to explain that at customs. The friend posts it. The internet watches it 400,000 times in a week. Then the comment section does what comment sections do. Divides immediately into 2 camps. The people saying, "This happened to me exactly," and the people saying, "I am doing this tonight." The second group was larger. This was 2006, and YouTube was barely a year old, and had not yet figured out what it was, and Salvia figured it out for them, which is how a plant from a single valley in Oaxaca that had spent centuries being carefully concealed from the outside world became one of the most watched spectacles on the internet. The shepherdess, for the record, had not been consulted about this career pivot. Within a month, there were dozens of copycat videos. People filming themselves, filming their friends, filming the friend of a friend who had heard about it and wanted to try it and needed someone to hold the camera. The format was completely consistent despite no one coordinating it. Chair, pipe, hit, departure, return, laugh, attempt to explain. As if the plant had a preferred presentation format and everyone discovered it independently. Some people filmed their pets' reactions during the 6 minutes. The pets were largely unmoved. Dogs would sniff the person, look concerned in the particular way dogs look concerned when humans do something inexplicable. The same face they make at vacuum cleaners and umbrellas and their own reflections, and then go lie down somewhere, which is a reasonable response and possibly the wisest thing anyone did throughout this entire period. A third group appeared in the comments that nobody had anticipated. People who had tried Salvia years earlier, in the quiet, Erowid days before the videos, who had never seen it rendered visually before, and who were watching with the expression of someone seeing a photograph of a place they visited in a dream and had half assumed wasn't real. "I thought I was the only one," read one comment under a video of a person becoming briefly convinced they were a segment of fence. The reply count was significant. Nobody had been the only one. Nobody had ever been the only one. They just had no way of knowing that until the internet handed them a camera and a comment section, and a legal plant from Oaxaca that nobody in charge had thought to do anything about yet. What made the videos compelling was the same thing that made them completely misleading. From the outside, the only angle any camera had, a Salvia trip looks manageable. Strange, yes. Slightly alarming, yes. But contained. A person in a chair. 6 minutes. They come back. Everyone laughs. What the camera couldn't show was the inside. The inside and the outside were not the same story. The internet only had cameras. The behaviours during those 6 minutes were specific, enough that they started developing their own taxonomy. There was the reaching. One arm extending towards something just off frame, calmly, with the certainty of someone retrieving a coffee cup they'd set down a moment ago. The coffee cup was never there. The arm didn't know that. It kept reaching anyway, with a patience that was somehow more unsettling than urgency would have been. There was the wall touching. Slow, deliberate, reverent. Both palms pressed flat against the nearest surface as though receiving a transmission. Some users later described believing the wall was trying to tell them something. The wall, for its part, has never confirmed this. The wall has been remarkably consistent on this point across every reported case. There was the object following, eyes tracking something across the ceiling that nobody else could see, with the focused attention of an air traffic controller watching a plane that isn't on anyone else's radar, moving left, pausing, moving right. Whatever it was doing something. The person watching it was very interested in what. There was the talking to something, not to the friend in the room, not to the camera, but to something else, something just to the left of where the camera was pointing, addressed with the quiet urgency of someone continuing a very important conversation that had been going on for some time before the video started. The words were almost words. The tone was completely clear. There was the unfinished sentence. Normal start, somewhere else ending. I think I need to... The thing about there's a... And then silence, and the head tilt, and the 6 minutes doing what they do. Every video had one. Always mid-thought. Always the same specific moment where the sentence stopped being a sentence and became something the speaker couldn't quite pilot anymore. And there was the laugh on return. Always the laugh. Not the laugh of someone who found something funny, but the laugh of someone whose body has just rediscovered the ability to laugh and is testing it with mild surprise. The way you'd flex a hand after it fell asleep, pressing carefully to see if it still works, slightly amazed that it does. The laugh said, "I'm back. I didn't know I was gone until just now. I'm back." The friend's face in these videos was always interesting too, because the friend was watching all of this from the outside. The reaching, the wall touching, the air traffic control, the conversation with something off camera. And the friend's job was officially to be a responsible sitter, a calm presence, someone who could be trusted to manage the situation. In practice, the friend spent 6 minutes trying very hard not to laugh at their own roommate with mixed results. The videos were watched, shared, commented on, clipped and re-uploaded, posted to forums that no longer exist, in threads that have since been archived and re-archived and are now somewhere in the internet's geological record, preserved in amber. The outside looked manageable. 6 minutes of strangeness and a laugh and a friend who couldn't quite keep a straight face. But the archive was filling up, and the archive told a completely different story. The Erowid Trip reports from this period were, to put it plainly, a new genre of human writing. Not because the experiences were always bad, many weren't, but because they were so consistently impossible to describe that the attempts had developed their own conventions, their own vocabulary, their own specific flavour of articulate bewilderment that existed nowhere else in literature and has not been replicated since. The reports always ran long. They ran long because the writers kept stopping, backtracking, and starting over from a different angle. I became the wall. No, that's not right. I became aware that I had always been the wall. No, the wall became aware that it had briefly been me. This particular construction appeared in various forms in dozens of reports. The writers were not being evasive. They were being precise. The language just wasn't built for what they needed it to do, and they were trying to build it in real time, retroactively in a forum post. They used words like visited and received and folded into. They described realities that were more convincing than reality, and ordinary life as the part that felt like a dream once you came back to it. They were written by people who were clearly intelligent, clearly trying hard, and clearly missing the conceptual vocabulary the Mazatec had spent centuries developing for exactly this purpose. A vocabulary that existed, was documented, and was available in the ethnobotanical literature that none of them had read because they had found the product on a forum and ordered it in an unmarked envelope instead. Then there was the ceiling fan report. A user who became convinced for 6 minutes that they were the ceiling fan, not watching the ceiling fan, not imagining being the ceiling fan. They were the ceiling fan, had always been the ceiling fan. Their entire previous life as a human being was a strange dream they'd just woken from, and the rotating part was their true self. The chain that turned the light on was apparently deeply meaningful. They came back, sat quietly for a while and wrote it up carefully. Filed under, unusual, not distressing. The ceiling fan, as far as anyone knows, was unaffected by any of this. Someone else spent 6 minutes in the complete, unshakable certainty that they had accidentally triggered the end of everything. Not panicked, quietly resigned, the way you'd accept bad weather. They understood the only way to prevent it was to sit perfectly still and not tell anyone. They sat perfectly still. They told no one. 4 days later, once they were reasonably confident the universe had continued as normal, they submitted the report. They noted for completeness that they remained uncertain what exactly they had done and recommended not doing it again. The universe had no comment. One person became a zipper, which does not require additional explanation. It's a zipper. They became it. They had thoughts about it from the inside, considered specific thoughts about what it was like to be a zipper, which they found genuinely illuminating at the time. They wrote those thoughts down and submitted them to a public database where they remain, available to anyone to this day. The zipper is not aware of this. Another spent 6 minutes pursuing what they described as a presence moving through the room, something that kept just ahead of them, something that seemed to want to be followed rather than caught. They followed it through what they described as several layers of space not normally visible. They did not catch it. They came back to the chair with a specific expression of someone who almost understood something very important and is not sure whether to feel disappointed or grateful. A different user received what they could only describe as a comprehensive explanation of the wallpaper's entire history and emotional inner life, delivered clearly and in full, which they found completely convincing at the time and entirely unavailable 45 minutes later. They described the loss of this information as their most significant intellectual disappointment in recent memory. One person needed to fold themselves in half. They spent the full 6 minutes on this. They did not succeed. They remained uncertain whether this was a failure or a mercy. And someone became the corner of the room, not the wall, specifically the corner, which they described as a position of considerable structural responsibility and surprising emotional depth. What united all of them, the fan, the universe ender, the zipper, the wallpaper scholar, the corner, wasn't strangeness. It was conviction. Nobody described it as a hallucination. A word that implies knowing the thing isn't real. They described it as a place they went, a thing they became, a truth they held for 6 minutes and then lost, like a dream you remember perfectly on waking and can't quite locate an hour later. The archive grew, the reports kept coming, and the people writing them were overwhelmingly fine, bewildered, wordless, occasionally convinced they'd briefly been load-bearing architecture, but physically fine. Nobody was waking up craving more corner-of-the-room experience. The experiences were intense, strange, and completely non-addictive in the clinical sense, which was exactly what the researchers who'd studied it had found, and exactly what none of the people about to make it illegal were going to mention. The archive kept growing, and the story it was quietly building was about to become someone else's emergency. The extracts were the part nobody had planned for. Dried leaf was one thing, already more intense than anything the traditional method produced, already stripped of every ceremonial context the Mazatec had considered essential, but at least within the general territory of what the plant had always been. The extracts were something else entirely, and they arrived fast. By the early 2000s, you could order them online, not from a single careful researcher with a thoughtfully written website, but from multiple vendors competing on potency and price, the way vendors compete on anything when a market develops faster than anyone expected, and before anyone with authority has noticed it exists. eBay had listings, specialty sites had comparison charts, forums had threads debating the relative merits of the 20 times concentrate versus the 40 times concentrate, with the seriousness of audio files discussing speaker cables, 5 times concentrated, 10, 20, 40, each number representing a further step from the valley, from the ceremony, from anything resembling the conditions under which this plant had spent centuries being. Used with care, the journey from 5 times to 40 times concentrated took less than 3 years. The Mazatec tradition had taken 600. The 40 times concentrate was a concentration so far beyond the traditional experience that describing them as the same substance was like describing a lightning bolt and a birthday candle as both being fire. Technically accurate, practically meaningless. The birthday candle was there to mark an occasion. The lightning bolt did not ask permission. Users described the 40 times concentrate as the difference between opening a door and having the door, the wall, the building, the street, and your prior certainty that any of these things had ever existed. removed simultaneously, without warning, and without a scheduled return time. Some described it as being fired from a cannon into a place that had no coordinates. Some described receiving information from sources they could not identify on topics they could not later recall with the persistent certainty that the information had been important. Some described it in terms that had never previously appeared in any human language and have not appeared since. Some came back fine, some came back shaken, some came back having had experiences so far outside any available framework that they spent weeks trying to find language for them, and eventually gave up and submitted something to Erowid anyway, noting that the words were inadequate, but that inadequate words were the only ones available. They posted the videos. The 40 times extract videos were different from the earlier ones, harder to watch. The behaviours were less funny and more alarming. The reaching had become something else. The unfinished sentences had stopped starting. The laugh on return when it came was slower and quieter, and didn't quite reach the eyes. The comment section met them with the same capitals crowd, who had watched the first round of videos, learned nothing and upgraded. The head shops were not confused about what they were selling. They knew it was a powerful psychedelic. The videos were everywhere. You couldn't miss them if you were in the business of selling the product featured in them. The customers came in asking for it by name, in the specific way that customers ask for something they've researched online, and those customers had watched the videos, and the videos were not subtle about what the product did. They sold it anyway. This is not a criticism. This is a description. Head shops occupy the specific legal territory between technically permitted and obviously not what this was intended for, and they have inhabited that territory with remarkable consistency for decades, and the model works, and nobody in that transaction is operating under genuine illusions about what's happening. It is a transaction between two adults who both know exactly what the product is, and have both decided for their respective reasons to proceed. Magic Mint, Sally D. Diviner's Sage. Names carefully chosen to sound either harmless or exciting depending on which end of the counter you are standing, and which managed, across all variations, to convey absolutely nothing about what the product actually did to the human brain at the molecular level. Magic Mint in particular was a triumph of branding. It sounds like a candy. It sounds like something your grandmother keeps in a dish by the door. It does not sound like the most potent naturally occurring psychedelic on Earth, which is what it was. Displayed behind the counter, or sometimes on the counter, in small packets with clip art logos designed by someone with 30 minutes and access to a computer from 2001. Next to the novelty lighters, next to the incense, next to the glass pipes that were for tobacco, as the signs clearly stated, in exactly the way that convinced nobody in the entire history of head shop retail. The label said, "Not for human consumption," which is the retail industry's way of saying, "We are aware of what you're about to do with this. We've noted our objection for legal purposes. The record will show we said not to. The record will also show you bought it anyway, and these two facts will coexist without resolution for as long as the relevant statute of limitations allows. No age checks, because it was a plant and plants didn't require age checks, and nobody had yet gotten around to specifying that this particular plant was the exception. A 14-year-old and a 40-year-old could walk up to the same counter and have the same transaction, which is information that would have alarmed the Mazatec considerably, but which the head shop considered legally none of its business. No conversations about the velada, no mention that a community in the Sierra Mazateca had spent centuries learning exactly what this plant required, and that none of those requirements were currently being met, and that the gap between what they knew and what was happening behind this counter was very large and getting larger every week. $65 for 1 gram of 40 times concentrate. No assembly required. Daniel Siebert watched all of this with the expression of a man who wrote the manual, watched everyone skip the manual, and is now being asked to explain the damage. He had published the first English language guide to salvia use in the early 90s, thorough, careful, built around the conviction that this compound deserved serious engagement, and that serious engagement required accurate information. He had genuinely believed that if the information was available, people would use it. He was an optimist of the particular kind that certain researchers become. High opinion of human beings in the abstract, insufficient reckoning with human beings on the early internet, where information was available and largely decorative. The guide was read the way assembly instructions are read, after the thing was already in pieces on the floor, and even then only the section that seemed immediately relevant, which was never the safety section, and was usually the section that confirmed the thing you'd already decided to do. What he hadn't fully anticipated was the extracts. He had sold dried leaves and modest preparations, calibrated his guidelines to those, and operated on the understanding that people engaging with this compound would engage with it seriously. The 40 times concentrate that head shops were now selling had roughly the same relationship to what he described as a weather forecast has to a hurricane. Same general subject, completely different scale, and the gap between them is precisely where people got into trouble. There was also the particular irony that he was the person who'd established that smoking worked. He had done that. He had published it. He had made that information available because he believed correctly that people were going to try it regardless, and accurate information about a thing people are going to do anyway is better than no information. This is a reasonable position. It is also the kind of reasonable position that looks different in retrospect, when the thing people were going to do anyway turned out to be doing it with extracts 40 times stronger than anything in his guidelines, on camera, for an audience of several 100,000 people who were mostly watching to decide whether to do it themselves. He was not naive about this. He had included warnings. He had been explicit about dose. He had described in detail what happened when the compound arrived too fast at too high a concentration. He had done everything correctly except for the one thing that would have actually helped, which was to somehow prevent the 40 times concentrate from being manufactured and sold at all. And that, for various legal reasons, was not something he had any power to do. By 2006, he was writing letters to legislators, patiently, specifically, with citations, explaining what salvia actually was, what the science showed, why the videos were missing the real issue, why prohibition would kill the research that might eventually produce something genuinely useful. The legislators thanked him for his input in the specific tone that legislators use when they have already decided what they're going to do and are being polite about it. They continued reacting to the videos. The videos, in fairness to the legislators, were quite something. The media found the videos in 2006 and built a story from them that had almost nothing to do with what was actually happening, which is, to be fair, not a new development in the history of drug coverage, but which achieved a particular elegance in this case. Legal but lethal? Factually uncertain on both counts, which the question mark helpfully acknowledged while doing nothing to address. The new marijuana, a comparison suggesting the journalist had watched 45 seconds of footage and filed, without consulting a single person who had tried either substance. Salvia and marijuana share roughly the same relationship as a volcano and a campfire. Both involve combustion. The similarities end there. One of them makes you want chips, the other one makes you briefly convinced you are the chips. The drug that's destroying our children. Written before any children had been demonstrably destroyed by it, on the theory that the headline would age better if it turned out to be true, and that even if it didn't, nobody was going to check. One Illinois legislator stated on the record that salvia looks like marijuana but has the psychoactive properties of LSD. It looks nothing like marijuana. It also has nothing to do with LSD. Both halves of this statement were wrong in different directions, which is a statistical achievement of sorts. This was publicly available information. The search was not performed. The statement was made. The cameras filmed it. a Wisconsin lawmaker named Sheldon Wasserman, who was also notably a licensed physician, appeared on Fox News to discuss salvia. He mentioned he had never heard of it before seeing the Fox segment. He then explained what needed to be done about it. The gap between "never heard of it" and "here is my legislative solution" was in this case approximately 48 hours. Dr. Wasserman's medical training had not prepared him for this particular compound. His political training had prepared him for exactly this moment. "This bill," he said, "is all about protecting our children. It is always about protecting the children. In 40 years of American drug panics, it has never once been about anything other than protecting the children. The children, who are generally fine, serve a structural function in these moments. They are the reason the conversation cannot wait for evidence." The format was identical across every network, every local affiliate, every morning show that ran a segment. Concerned, anchor, ominous music, footage of a teenager in a chair doing something alarming, local expert with 48 hours of background, concerned parent, B-roll of a head shop, return to anchor. Is your child in danger? The answer was always yes. The answer is always yes. Nobody has ever run the segment. Is your child probably fine? Experts cautiously suggest possibly. That segment does not exist. It has never been greenlit. It would not get the ratings and the anchor would not know which face to make. In Utah, a state representative named Paul Ray watched a segment on KSL television one evening. The segment showed the videos. The segment used the voice. Paul Ray, a man who had not heard of Salvia divinorum 7 days earlier, decided by the end of the segment that he knew exactly what needed to be done. The next morning he filed a bill to make it Schedule 1 in Utah. The KSL cameras were there to film him filing the bill. The segment that produced the bill was now a segment about the bill. The bill would produce another segment. The segment would reach another legislator in another state. That legislator would file another bill. The cameras would return. The anchor would use the voice. This loop had been running on other subjects for decades and had never once been interrupted by anyone asking whether the cameras filming the bill might themselves be part of the mechanism producing the problem. Nobody called a scientist. Nobody was going to call a scientist. Scientists require more than 48 hours to form opinions, don't deliver them in the concerned anchor voice, and have a persistent, professionally inconvenient habit of saying things like, "The evidence suggests the situation is considerably more complicated than that," which is not a sentence that has ever improved a cable news segment, and which cable news producers have accordingly learned to root around, underneath, and as far away from as possible. Somewhere in Delaware, a 17-year-old named Brett Chidester had been ordering extracts from a Canadian website. Good grades, quiet, loved skateboarding. He'd found salvia the way most teenagers found it in 2005. A link on a forum, a legal purchase, shipped to the door with no conversation, no context, no one on either end of the transaction who understood what it was or what it required, or what 600 years of accumulated knowledge about it looked like. On January 23, 2006, his parents found him in the garage. He had died by suicide. He was 17 years old. His parents went looking for answers. They found his diary. The diary referenced salvia. It also contained philosophical reflections about existence, the feeling that the world wasn't quite real, the pointlessness of things, the kind of writing that appears in the diaries of people in pain and in the diaries of people processing a psychedelic experience and in the diaries of thoughtful teenagers and in the diaries of many people who do not go on to die by suicide. For his parents, the connection was clear. For the state of Delaware, the connection was enough. 3 months later, they passed Brett's Law. Salvia divinorum was now, in Delaware, a Schedule 1 controlled substance. Same category as heroin, same category as methamphetamine, based on one case. based on a diary, based on a connection between two entries in a notebook, which is not the same thing as a causal connection in the world, but which is, it turns out, more than sufficient to pass a law when a grieving family is willing to go on television and a legislature is looking for something to do. The details that didn't fit the narrative were noted and set aside. The toxicology report found no salvinorin A in Brett's system at the time of his death, meaning whatever role Salvia had played in his life, it had not played it that day. The suicide note did not mention Salvia. Brett had reportedly told his parents he'd stopped using it weeks before. The death certificate was later amended to list Salvia as a contributing factor by a medical examiner who, when asked to explain the amendment, declined to comment, and has declined every subsequent time she's been asked. None of this slowed the law. Brett's law passed in 3 months. The Delaware legislature moved with a speed and conviction it had never previously demonstrated on any issue that didn't involve a grieving family, a sympathetic news cycle, and a substance most of the legislature had never heard of 6 months earlier. Brett's mother, Kathy Chidester, went on CBS, ABC, CNN. She told her son's story. She quoted him, "Mum, it's legal. There's nothing wrong with it. If it was bad, it wouldn't be legal." That quote travelled far. It travelled because it was true. Not about Salvia specifically, but about the logic that had made it available. Legal meant safe was a reasonable inference from a reasonable world. The inference was wrong. The world on this particular question was not reasonable, and the gap between legal and safe was exactly the gap that head shops, eBay vendors, and the early internet had been occupying for years. The news had its story. The template was built. Delaware had shown every other state exactly how it was done. 1 case, a diary, 3 months, cameras at every stage, a law named after a teenager. All it needed now was repetition, and 28 other states were about to provide it. The machine Delaware built was elegant in its simplicity. A segment created a legislator created a bill created a segment, the segment created another legislator. Round and round, clean and fast, with no off switch and no one looking for one. It ran beautifully. What most people don't know is that Delaware wasn't actually first. Louisiana banned Salvia in 2005, a full year before Brett's law, before the YouTube videos went viral, before most of the country had heard the name. Louisiana banned it alongside 39 other plants in a single piece of legislation. 39. Someone in the Louisiana state legislature had compiled a list of every plant that had ever appeared in an ethnobotanical forum or an obscure psychedelic research paper, and banned the entire list at once. It was the legislative equivalent of responding to a wasp in your kitchen by burning down the house. Thorough, immediate, and largely unconcerned with proportionality. Most of the 39 plants were so obscure that the researchers who studied them didn't know they'd been banned until someone mentioned it at a conference. Delaware then did it properly, with a name, a family, a news cycle, and a template that other states could follow. Missouri went in 2006, Tennessee the same year, North Dakota and Illinois in 2007, Kansas, Mississippi, Virginia in 2008, Michigan in 2010, Kentucky the same year, Pennsylvania in 2011. The names and states changed. Everything else stayed exactly the same. The concerned anchor, the footage of the chair, the local expert with 48 hours of background, the bill filed before anyone had read a single peer-reviewed paper. 14 states introduced legislation in the 6 months after Delaware. 14. A plant that had spent centuries in one valley in Oaxaca, tended by healers, known to 6 researchers and essentially no one else, had become the urgent legislative priority of more than a quarter of the United States simultaneously in under half a year. The shepherdess had not anticipated this level of administrative attention. What each of these states shared, beyond the ban itself, was the speed. The average time between a legislator first hearing about salvia and filing a bill was measured not in months but in weeks, sometimes days. The research had taken decades. The ban took a news cycle. Wisconsin's Dr. Wasserman, the physician-turned-legislator who had needed 48 hours to form his opinion, was not the outlier. He was the template. In Illinois, a legislator filed a bill and gave a statement claiming salvia looked like marijuana and had the psychoactive properties of LSD. Both halves were wrong. The statement was made in public, on the record, with cameras present. Nobody in the room corrected it. The bill moved forward. This is not because the legislators were uniquely uninformed. It's because being informed was not a requirement of the process. The process required a segment, a bill, and a vote. Background reading was optional and largely skipped. In Tennessee, the ban passed before the ink was dry on the Delaware law it was modelled on. The speed was not incidental. It was the point. Speed was what demonstrated seriousness. A legislature that paused to gather evidence was a legislature that didn't care enough about the children. The children needed protecting now, before the evidence arrived and complicated things. What drove the machine was not evidence. Evidence takes time. Time to gather, time to scrutinize, time to present in a format that survives a question. There was no time for evidence. It ran on footage, and the footage existed, and it was very difficult to watch a person briefly become a ceiling fan and conclude that nothing needed to be done about it immediately, before anything was known. The scientists who had studied this plant for years watched from a specific distance, close enough to see exactly what was wrong, far enough that nobody was calling them. Behind several of the most vocal sponsors of salvia legislation was a donor list that had nothing to do with child safety. The Delaware senator who sponsored Brett's law had received campaign contributions from the beer and wine industry. The Oregon legislator who argued most loudly for Schedule I classification had the Oregon Beer and Wine Distributors Association as one of their largest donors. These connections were documented. They were a matter of public record. Journalists reported them. They were then largely set aside because the alternative, that the alcohol industry was funding drug prohibition for competitive reasons, was the kind of observation that made everyone in the room slightly uncomfortable and so was not dwelt upon. But the logic was not difficult to follow. The alcohol industry had spent decades watching prohibition-era thinking erode. Cannabis was moving toward legalization in state after state. Alternative substances were finding audiences. The market was changing in ways that were not good for beer and wine. A plant that sent people somewhere else for 6 minutes, without a hangover, without calories, without a brewery or a vineyard or a distribution network or a lobbyist in every state capital, was not a plant the industry had a strong interest in seeing remain available. Consider the symmetry quietly, because nobody at the time was considering it loudly. The substance responsible for more deaths annually than every currently banned drug combined was funding the effort to ban a plant with no confirmed direct fatalities. The industry that produces alcohol, which kills tens of thousands of Americans every year, was sponsoring legislation to protect children from Salvia divinorum. The legislation passed. The children were protected. The alcohol continued. The donor list remained a footnote. The segments did not mention it. The concerned anchor voice was not deployed in its direction. Some symmetries are too uncomfortable to be useful. The children needed protecting. The plant needed banning. The footnote needed ignoring. The D.E.A. had a problem with salvia. The problem was that it didn't quite fit. The agency had been watching the state bans accumulate since 2006. By 2007, enough states had acted that something federal was expected, some official position some acknowledgement that the agency whose entire purpose was controlling dangerous substances had noticed the dangerous substance. In 2007, the D.E.A. initiated what is called an 8-factor analysis, the formal process for evaluating whether a substance should be added to the federal Schedule 1 list. The 8-factor analysis is not fast. It is not supposed to be fast. It exists precisely to prevent the Delaware problem, a 3-month sprint from grief to legislation with no stops for evidence. The federal process required documented abuse potential, documented health hazards, documented scope of the problem, and documented absence of accepted medical use. It required, in short, the kind of careful consideration that the previous state bans had collectively managed to skip entirely. Here is where the D.E.A. ran into difficulty. The documented abuse potential was ambiguous. The videos existed and the concern was genuine, but documented physical harm was thin. Nobody had died from salvia directly. Nobody had been hospitalized from an overdose. The emergency room data that typically anchors a scheduling decision was largely absent. The harm was real, but psychological, contextual, difficult to quantify in the format the 8-factor analysis required, and crucially, far more dependent on how the substance was used than on the substance itself, which is not a sentence that fits neatly into a scheduling document. The documented health hazards were largely theoretical. The long-term effects of occasional use were essentially unstudied, not because nobody had tried to study them, but because the political climate had made funding for psychedelic research nearly impossible for 2 decades before the current panic, which had now created the panic that was preventing the research that would have resolved the uncertainty, a neat circle closed against itself. And then there was the medical use question, which was the genuinely awkward one, because the researchers who had been studying salvinorin A had been finding things. The kappa opioid system was a legitimate therapeutic target: depression, addiction, chronic pain. The preliminary findings were early but real. The case for accepted medical use was not established, but it was developing. Scheduling would kill the development. The D.E.A. was being asked to classify something as having no accepted medical use at exactly the moment when that use was starting to appear on the horizon, which is not a position any bureaucracy is well equipped to handle gracefully. They received Siebert's letter. They received the scientist's correspondence. They sat with it. So the D.E.A. did what bureaucracies do when they cannot move forward and cannot stand still. They kept the analysis open. It stayed open, and open. The states banned. The media ran segments. The politicians filed bills. And the federal government, the single entity with the power to either definitively schedule salvia or definitively protect the research, sat with its 8-factor analysis in a drawer and waited for a clarity that was not coming. The result was a situation nobody had designed and nobody was fixing. 29 states had made it Schedule 1. The federal government had not moved. The drug that state after state had declared equivalent to heroin was, at the federal level, still technically legal. A researcher in a non-banned state could, in theory, study it. In theory, with the right license, from the right supplier, with the right facility, which described in practice approximately 2 institutions in the entire country. Nobody in Washington explained this gap. Nobody was going to explain it. The file sat in its drawer and waited, patiently, indefinitely, for a political moment that kept not arriving. Then a pop star sat down at a birthday party and picked up a pipe. December 2010. Miley Cyrus had just turned 18. The video was filmed 5 days after her birthday at a party at her home in Los Angeles. She was at the specific moment in her career where Hannah Montana was definitively behind her, and the adult reinvention was still finding its shape, which meant she was simultaneously the most famous teenager in America and the most watched symbol of American teenage innocence, and both of those things were about to become relevant to a drug policy story. She took a hit. What followed was, by Salvia standards, entirely mild. 6 minutes of giggling. She kept looking at someone across the room and announcing that they looked like her boyfriend Liam Hemsworth. He was not there. She found this delightful. At one point she said she was having a little bit of a bad trip, in the cheerful tone of someone who finds the concept of a bad trip more amusing than alarming. She laughed the laugh. She came back. The Aeroid archive would have filed it under fine, basically. The universe remained intact. No zipper hoods were required. TMZ published the video on December 10th. It was watched by approximately everyone. The coverage did something interesting with the Hannah Montana angle. Miley Cyrus was, at this point, legally an adult in every state in America. She was 18 years old. She had taken a legal substance in a state where it was legal, at her own home, at a private party. None of this was a crime. The coverage treated it as one anyway. Not explicitly, but in tone, in framing, in the choice of which photographs to run alongside the story and which experts to call. The experts called were uniformly alarmed. The photographs chosen were uniformly ones from the Hannah Montana era, in which she looked approximately 12. The juxtaposition did the work the facts couldn't. The word children appeared in the coverage with remarkable frequency for a story that was technically about an 18-year-old adult doing something legal in her own home. The mechanism was not deception. It was the careful deployment of implication. Hannah Montana was a children's show. Miley Cyrus had been Hannah Montana. Therefore, in some ambient cultural sense, Miley Cyrus remained adjacent to children, and therefore her choices carried a different moral weight than the choices of an 18-year-old adult who had never been on a Disney program. The logic did not survive scrutiny. It did not need to survive scrutiny. It needed to run for one news cycle, which it did. She later described it as a mistake. "I made a mistake," she told Marie Claire. "I'm disappointed in myself for disappointing my fans." The framing, disappointment directed at herself, expressed through the lens of fan expectations, is the specific language of a person who has been coached on how to apologize for something they were legally entitled to do. It is a distinct register. It is recognizable once you've heard it a few times. The apology was accepted. The coverage moved on. The state bans it had triggered did not move on. The state bans stayed. Billy Ray Cyrus, her father, took to Twitter. "Sorry guys," he wrote, "I had no idea. Just saw this stuff for the first time myself. I'm so sad." The tweet was addressed to the general public rather than to his daughter, which is a parenting choice. He didn't comment on who had filmed his daughter at her own birthday party and sold the footage to a celebrity news outlet, which is a different kind of choice, and one that nobody in the coverage pursued. Kathy Chidester, Brett's mother, 4 years into her campaign, responded to the video. "Brett's name is showing up everywhere," she said. "I'm thankful." It was a sentence that contained an enormous amount of history in a very small space, and it was the most honest thing said publicly about the Miley Cyrus Salvia story, which is notable given that it came from the most personally invested person in the room. States that had stalled reintroduced legislation. The New York Senate passed a ban. Legislators who had filed bills that died in committee found the political moment had returned, warmer and more amenable. A young woman, just barely an adult, had giggled on camera, and it had been on every screen for a week, and the machine that Delaware had built and Missouri and Tennessee and 14 other states had run was gearing up again. California, where the video was filmed, never banned salvia. The irony was structural and nobody mentioned it. The state that produced the footage that produced the legislation was the one state that declined to pass the legislation. Miley Cyrus had triggered bans in states 1,000 miles away from a Los Angeles living room where the whole thing had been entirely legal. The coverage did not find this worth noting. The coverage had an angle. The angle was working. The California detail was not part of it. Then the coverage acquired a body count. In January 2011, Jared Loughner shot Congresswoman Gabby Giffords outside a supermarket in Tucson, Arizona. He killed 6 people. He wounded 13 others. He was 22 years old. The coverage was enormous and sustained. Months of front pages, congressional hearings, national conversations about mental illness, gun access, political rhetoric, and the specific conditions that produce someone who does what he did. Somewhere in the reporting it emerged that Loughner had used Salvia. Not that day, not recently. At some point in his life, he had used it. There was no established connection between Salvia used in the shooting. No toxicology placed it in his system in January. No evidence suggested any relationship between the two facts beyond their presence in the same biography. The reporting noted it anyway, because it was there, because the substance was currently in the news, and because mass shooter had used drug currently being banned by 29 states was a sentence that wrote itself. The reader connected the dots. This is how moral panics absorb new information, not by establishing causation, but by accumulating association. It is a slow process. It works by addition rather than argument. Salvia had been a legal high teenagers were abusing on YouTube, a substance a grieving family blamed for their son's death, something a Disney star giggled through 5 days after her 18th birthday. And now, in the same breath as a mass shooting, even without a causal claim, even with a full paragraph of qualifications, it was there. The qualifications don't travel. The association travels. Each new connection added weight without adding proof. The substance accumulated a reputation the way certain people accumulate enemies, not through any single decisive incident, but through a steady pattern of proximity to the wrong events at the wrong times, until the pattern itself becomes the argument, and the argument no longer requires evidence because the pattern is self-evident to anyone who has been paying attention. Nobody was asking what it would look like if Loughner had also, at some point in his life, consumed alcohol, because the answer was obvious, and the answer undermined the frame, and the frame was what everybody needed in that moment. Nobody was asking whether the coverage of the shooting itself, the saturated, round-the-clock, name-and-face repeating coverage that research had consistently shown to correlate with subsequent incidents, might be worth examining. That question was also not asked. The question that was asked was, what substances had this person used? The answer among others was Salvia. The Salvia answer was published. The other answers received proportional coverage. The proportions were instructive. The Village Voice observed, only deaths seemed to spur action. They were not wrong, and the coverage had now located something close enough to a death, the closest it had ever been, and the action that followed was predictable in form if not in scale. By 2012, the legal map of Salvia divinorum in America was a document that defied rational explanation and rewarded none. In Florida, possession was a felony, up to 5 years. A plant that flourished in a window box in 30 states could put you in a Florida prison for 5 years, which is longer than many sentences for crimes involving actual victims of actual harm. Florida had made a determination. The determination was recorded in statute. The reasoning was not. In New Mexico, you could grow it in your garden, legally. Out front between the rosemary and the basil, a neighbour might stop to admire it. You could tell them what it was. You could hand them a cutting. Nothing would happen. Drive from New Mexico to Texas, a drive many people make on a regular Thursday, carrying whatever is in their car, and the same plant becomes a criminal matter. Cross from California into Arizona. Same road, same plant, different legal reality, beginning at an invisible line that the plant has no ability to recognize and no interest in respecting. In Michigan, possession carried a potential sentence of 1 year. In adjacent Ohio, it was legal. A person could stand on one side of Lake Erie holding salvia and be committing a misdemeanor. On the other side, the same person holding the same plant was a gardener. And it wasn't only America. 13 countries had banned it internationally: Australia, Denmark, Estonia, Latvia, Finland, Norway, Sweden, Belgium, Italy, Poland, Romania, South Korea, Japan. Each had arrived at the ban through its own version of the same process. A segment or a news story or a parliamentary question from someone who had seen a segment, followed by a bill, followed by a vote, followed by a law. The shepherdess, who had spent her entire existence in one mountain valley in Mexico and had never expressed any interest in international travel, was now simultaneously a Schedule I equivalent in 3 continents. Guam banned it. Guam, which has a land area of approximately 212 square miles and sits in the western Pacific several thousand miles from the nearest Mexican mountain range, had decided this plant was a threat requiring formal legislative response. Nobody had designed this patchwork. It had assembled itself, state by state, country by country, news cycle by news cycle, into a map that bore no relationship to any coherent principle, not even the incoherent principle of harm prevention, since the jurisdictions with the harshest penalties had no more evidence of harm than those that had never banned it at all. The harm data was identical across the map. The legal response varied enormously. The difference between them was television coverage and the particular temperament of whoever happened to watch it. Legal scholars occasionally cited it as a case study in what policy looks like when it is built from momentum rather than analysis. The citations were accurate and academic. The people navigating the patchwork in real life experienced it differently. The federal government looked at all of this and maintained its position. The 8-factor analysis remained open. The D.E.A. had no further comment. Thank you for your patience. The shepherdess remained in the valley, tended by the same people, unbothered by the patchwork, indifferent to the question of whether she was contraband or a houseplant, because the question was not one she'd ever been asked, and not one she had a mechanism for answering. She'd been there before any of this started. The strong implication was that she would be there after. The researchers understood something the legislators did not. Scheduling wasn't just a legal classification, it was a research death sentence. Schedule 1 meant no accepted medical use, which was the government's position, not a scientific finding and not a permanent truth, but a designation that, once applied, made the scientific process for challenging it nearly impossible to navigate. It meant any researcher wanting to study the compound needed a Schedule I research license, an application process measured in years, a facility meeting federal physical security standards, a protocol approved by multiple agencies, and a supply from a federally approved provider, of which there was, in practice, one in the entire country, which had a waiting list which was not accepting new applicants. Scheduling didn't make the research harder, it made the research a thing that happened somewhere else. The serious Salvinorin work moved abroad, to Europe, where several countries had not banned it, where the regulatory environment did not require a multi-year application process to ask a basic scientific question. American researchers watched their subject leave the jurisdiction. They watched questions they had spent years formulating, get answered in laboratories in other time zones, published in journals that American institutions had not funded and American law had not prevented. The research continued. It just no longer continued here. This was the catch that nobody in the legislative debates was discussing. The same years states were racing to ban salvia, peer-reviewed research was showing genuine potential against cocaine addiction. No existing treatment touched the specific craving mechanism that salvinorin A could reach through the kappa opioid system. Antidepressant effects were appearing in animal models. Early chronic pain results were circulating among researchers with cautious optimism. These findings were real, preliminary, and required more study. The more study was being prevented by the bans the findings were occurring alongside. None of this reached the segment. None of it was filmed. None of it had a name that needed protecting. The opioid crisis was already building. In the years that followed, it would kill tens of thousands of Americans annually. Cocaine addiction had no effective pharmaceutical treatment. Depression was managed with blunt instruments that worked inconsistently and were abandoned by roughly half the people prescribed them within the first year. And the compound that might, with sufficient research, with sufficient time, with the regulatory space to ask the questions properly, have offered something new against some of these problems was being classified, state by state, as equivalent to heroin. There is a specific kind of frustration that researchers describe when they talk about this period. Not outrage, not surprise, just the quiet, specific frustration of watching something important get foreclosed before it could be established by a process that was never interested in what they had to say in response to a problem the thing they were studying might eventually have helped address. The questions weren't going away. The ability to answer them in America, legally, with funding, with institutional support, that had gone. The federal ban never came. In 2002, a California congressman named Joe Backer filed a bill to put Salvia divinorum into Schedule 1 at the federal level. Same category as heroin, same category as the compounds the DEA had been classifying as the most dangerous substances on Earth since Nixon. The bill was straightforward. The political moment seemed right. The videos were circulating. The state bans were building. The bill died in committee. Not because of a public campaign. Not because voters pushed back. Because a small number of researchers, CBERT, the Center for Cognitive Liberty and Ethics, a handful of scientists who had spent years studying this compound, sent letters to Congress explaining what federal scheduling would actually do. Schedule 1 meant no accepted medical use, which meant no research license, which meant no clinical trials, which meant the work that was already showing genuine promise for depression and addiction would be foreclosed before it could become anything. The bill, facing these objections, didn't pass. The scientists had bought time. They didn't know what to do with it. What they had bought, specifically, was the difference between hard and impossible. Federal scheduling would have made the research effectively unreachable. Not just difficult, but the kind of difficult that quietly kills fields, where the paperwork outlasts the funding, and the funding outlasts the patients, and the patients outlast the careers. The scientists who stopped the Backer bill understood this. They had watched it happen to psilocybin research in the 1970s. They had watched it happen to MDMA research in the 1980s. Decades of genuine findings, foreclosed before they could become medicine, because a scheduling decision made in a political moment had locked the door, and nobody with the keys had any interest in finding them again. They were not going to let it happen a third time. Not if they could stop it. They stopped it, and the state legislatures, for their part, were not waiting for anyone to figure that out. A Delaware senator named Karen Peterson, explaining her support for Brett's law, offered what may be the most honest summary of the legislative reasoning across this entire period. I, for one, she said, don't want to be driving down Route 1 next to someone who's having an out-of-body experience. This is, in fairness, a reasonable thing not to want. It is also not how salvia works. The effects last 6 minutes. The person is sitting in a chair. The experience is so consuming that operating a vehicle is not a concern because operating a spoon is not a concern. The senator's worry was vivid, genuine, and based on a mental image that had nothing to do with the compound's actual mechanism. Nobody was driving on Route 1 on Salvia. The ceiling fan man was not a traffic hazard. He was a person sitting in a chair, briefly convinced he was a ceiling fan in a house, completely stationary. The bill passed anyway. The DEA's 8-factor analysis remained open, somewhere in a drawer in Washington, waiting for a clarity that was not arriving. The state bans accumulated, and the question of what this compound actually was, medically, for the people its researchers had been trying to help, stayed unanswered and was about to get harder to answer. Here is what the researchers were finding while the bans were being passed. Not theories, findings. The kappa opioid system was, it turned out, one of the most important systems nobody had been able to properly study. Researchers had known for years that it was a legitimate target for depression, addiction, pain. What they'd lacked was a clean, selective compound to study it with. The tools available were blunt and unpredictable. The research kept stalling at the same point. The compound they needed had been sitting in a valley in Mexico. For cocaine addiction, the results were striking. Animal models consistently showed that kappa opioid activation reduced cocaine-seeking behavior, the specific craving mechanism that drove relapse. Classic kappa opioid compounds had been known to do this for years, but they came with severe side effects. Sedation, dysphoria, the kind of experience that made them clinically unusable. Salvinorin A showed the same anti-addictive properties with a different profile. The researchers looked at the data and looked at each other. For depression, there was a case report. One woman, chronic depression, years of failed treatments, the specific grinding persistence of a condition that hadn't responded to anything available. She took small oral doses. The doses were tiny. Oral administration is far less potent than smoking. She went into remission, complete remission. The researchers wrote it up carefully, noting that one case is one case and one case is not a clinical trial. But one case is also not nothing. For pain, the compound offered something potentially remarkable. Analgesic effects through a receptor that doesn't trigger the brain's reward pathway. The classic opioid problem, treat the pain, create the addiction, might not apply here. The research was preclinical, early, not yet in humans, but it was pointing somewhere nobody had pointed before. There was also early research on multiple sclerosis, on neuroprotection after stroke, on schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. The findings were preliminary, which is another way of saying they were early, and early was exactly where the research needed to be. Early required time. Early required funding. Early required the ability to keep asking questions. The bans were removing the ability to keep asking questions, and none of it, not the cocaine findings, not the depression case report, not the pain mechanism, not any of it, made a single news segment. It didn't have footage. It couldn't be filmed. There was no chair, no pipe, no 6 minutes, no friend trying not to laugh. There was data in a journal that researchers read and policymakers didn't, accumulating in the background while the machine ran in the foreground. The opioid crisis would go on to kill 500,000 Americans in the following decade. The research quietly closed. The DEA had a choice to make. They did not make it. The 8-factor analysis had been running since 2007. Every piece of evidence the agency collected pointed in 2 directions at once. The harm was real but hard to quantify, psychological, contextual, nothing that fit neatly into a scheduling document. The medical potential was technically undeveloped but visibly developing, and scheduling would not pause the development. It would end it. The DEA was being asked to declare that a compound had no accepted medical use at the precise moment researchers were finding accepted medical uses. No bureaucracy is designed to handle that gracefully, so they held the analysis open, indefinitely. The file sat in its drawer while states banned and segments ran, and bills were filed. The federal government, the one entity whose decision would have settled the question either way, maintained its position. Analysis ongoing. No further comment. Thank you for your patience. What this created in practice was a contradiction nobody had bothered to explain publicly. 29 states had classified Salvia as Schedule 1 equivalent, same category as heroin, same penalties. The federal government had not moved, which meant the compound that state after state had declared equivalent to heroin was, at the federal level, unscheduled. A researcher could study it without a D.E.A. license. A head shop in a non-banned state could still sell it. And the D.E.A., the agency that existed to classify dangerous substances, had looked at all of this and concluded that its position was ongoing analysis, no further comment. The states had acted with certainty. The federal government was still thinking about it. Both of these things were simultaneously true, and nobody in Washington had been asked to explain how. The patience required turned out to be considerable. It still is. Somewhere around 2015, everything else changed. Just not for Salvia. Psilocybin was the one that moved first. Johns Hopkins, NYU. Rigorous clinical trials, replicable results, data that the mainstream medical establishment could process without flinching. Depression, end-of-life anxiety, addiction. The researchers were not Timothy Leary. They were clinicians presenting slide decks at conferences, and the slide decks had numbers, and the numbers were compelling. MDMA was next. Phase 3. Trials for post-traumatic stress disorder. Results so strong that the psychiatric community stopped arguing and started listening. Ketamine, a dissociative already in clinical use, was approved as a depression treatment, available in clinics, prescribed by psychiatrists who a decade earlier would not have touched the category. The FDA granted psilocybin breakthrough therapy designation. Cities decriminalized. States voted. The conversation that had been professionally dangerous for 50 years was happening in public, in institutions, with funding and infrastructure, and the kind of careful credentialing that the 1960s had never bothered to build and had paid for accordingly. The psychedelic renaissance had arrived. Every compound the 60s had made infamous was getting a second hearing. Everyone except Salvia. The absence wasn't an accident. It was a mechanism. To move a substance out of Schedule 1, or out of the cultural purgatory that state-level bans created, you needed clinical trial data. That's what changed the story for psilocybin. Data gave the medical establishment something to point at. It gave regulators something to process. It gave journalists a different sentence to write. Not teenager becomes ceiling fan, but terminal patient reports complete resolution of end-of-life anxiety. That reframing required data. Data required trials. Trials required a research environment. The state bans had made the research environment nearly impossible. Not federally impossible. The DEA had never scheduled it, which technically left the door open. But 29 state bans had created an atmosphere in which institutions were reluctant to apply for funding, researchers were reluctant to attach their names to it, and the general momentum of serious inquiry had drifted toward compounds with cleaner reputations and simpler paperwork. The serious research moved to Europe, quietly, without announcement, in the way that scientific momentum moves when one jurisdiction makes it unwelcoming. Not dramatically, just incrementally, proposal by proposal, until the people asking the questions were asking them somewhere else. American researchers watched their subject leave the jurisdiction. The ones who stayed and tried anyway learned something about what technically possible meant in practice. One researcher spent 18 months navigating the institutional approval process for a study on salvinorin A's effects on depression. assembling the facility requirements, the ethics board sign-offs, the supplier documentation, the protocol approvals. At the end of it, his institution's legal team reviewed the state-level scheduling in his state and the adjacent states where his research participants might travel, found the patchwork too complicated, and advised him to find a different compound. He found a different compound. The questions he'd been asking went unanswered for another several years, until someone in the Netherlands asked them instead, and published the results in a journal his institution subscribed to. He read the paper at his desk. The findings were roughly what he had expected. The circle looked like this. You needed data to rehabilitate the reputation. The reputation made producing the data nearly impossible. The impossibility prevented the data. The absence of data sustained the reputation. Round and round, clean, closed. Nobody had designed it. Everyone had helped build it. And then there was the YouTube problem, which was in some ways harder than all of it. Psilocybin's cultural baggage was Timothy Leary, the summer of love, the Beatles going to India, romantic, ridiculous, 40 years gone. The researchers could tell a new story over the top of it. The people who remembered it as threatening were in their 60s. The gap between 1967 and 2015 was large enough to drive a clinical trial through. Salvia's cultural story was 2006. The ceiling fan was still on YouTube. The universe ender was still on YouTube. The girl who almost folded herself in half was still on YouTube, with 2 million views, posted 11 years ago, still the first result when you search the name. You cannot place clinical trial data over a video with 2 million views. You can place it next to it, the video stays. Psilocybin had 50 years of distance from its embarrassing cultural moment. Salvia had 11. That gap mattered in ways no researcher could legislate around. The Renaissance was not going to treat them as equivalent, and the researchers, however frustrated, understood why. Brian Roth had been watching all of this since 2002. The man who mapped the mechanism, who had spent years watching the compound he'd decoded get classified alongside heroin in state after state, watching the research he'd opened get foreclosed before it could reach the people who needed it. He put it in 22 words. It should be regulated, he said, but it's more difficult to buy alcohol or cigarettes than this extremely potent hallucinogen. The first half, regulation, not prohibition, was the entire argument in 4 words. Regulation meant age checks. It meant accurate labels. It meant the difference between the 40 times concentrate and the dried leaf being explained to someone before they bought it rather than after. None of that existed, and none of it could exist through banning, because banning didn't regulate the product. It moved it somewhere with even less information attached. The second half, more difficult to buy alcohol than a potent hallucinogen, was the deadpan summary of someone who had watched the wrong things get scrutinized while the right things got a pass. Alcohol had a framework, labels, age verification, an acknowledgement, however imperfect, that the product was serious. Salvia, in the states that hadn't banned it, was a plant. Plants didn't have frameworks. Roth had mapped the molecule. He had not found a way to close that gap. A journalist named Matt Snyders, writing in Minneapolis, did what no legislator had been willing to do. He tried Salvia himself, documented the effects, then invited the representative proposing the state ban to observe the results firsthand. The representative had a response. Frankly, he said, it's not something that I have a considerable amount of time to do, even if I wanted to. Snyders then asked whether he would at least observe someone else try it. The answer was no, he was banning it anyway. This, in the history of American drug legislation, is not unusual. It is the norm. Across the country, the pattern held with remarkable consistency. Louisiana's bill sponsor had never tried it. Delaware's had never tried it. The Illinois representative who stated publicly that salvia looked like marijuana and had the psychoactive properties of LSD had clearly never tried either. In hearing after hearing in state after state, the person proposing the ban was someone who had watched a segment, formed a view, and arrived at the committee room having done no further research, because further research was not a requirement of the process, and the process was working fine without it. The researchers who had spent years studying the compound were occasionally invited to testify. Their testimony was received politely and did not change any votes. They used words like preliminary and mechanism and receptor profile in rooms where the other speakers were using words like children and danger and now. The rooms were not built for the first kind of language, they were built for the second. The researchers learned this. They kept showing up anyway because the alternative was not showing up, and not showing up felt worse. The bills passed, the researchers drove home, the drawer stayed full, the research didn't disappear, it just moved. European institutions picked up what American ones had dropped. Study continued in laboratories that weren't subject to the state bans, asking the questions the bans had made nearly impossible to ask here. The findings kept coming, quietly, in journals that policymakers didn't read, accumulating in the background while the panic machine wound slowly down, and the cultural memory of a teenager in a chair began, finally, to fade. The YouTube videos were still there, the views were still climbing. But 2006 was getting further away, and time does something to cultural panics that legislation cannot. It makes them seem, in retrospect, slightly embarrassing. The same compounds that had once triggered emergency hearings were now being discussed in the New York Times in the science section, not the crime section. The framing was shifting. The window, for the first time in decades, was opening. Just not for Salvia. Salvia's YouTube problem hadn't aged the way psilocybin's Timothy Leary problem had aged. The videos were recent. The faces were recognizable. The language of the coverage, dangerous, unpredictable, teenagers, panic, was still attached, still searchable, still the first thing anyone found when they looked. The research was there too if you went looking. Almost nobody went looking. The questions were still open. The compound was still there. The DEA's drawer was still full. And in 2021, someone in Berlin read all of it, all the research, all the findings, the cocaine studies and the depression case report and the kappa opioid mechanism and the 6-minute duration and the 29 state bans and the federal non-scheduling and the whole absurd patchwork of a compound that half the country had declared equivalent to heroin, while the other half was selling it next to incense without an age check. They didn't see a problem. They saw an opportunity. The company was called D.E.A Life Sciences, Nasdaq-listed, Berlin. Founded in 2018 by people who had looked at the clinical data accumulating around psychedelic compounds and decided with the specific confidence of people who have read something everyone else has ignored that this was a business opportunity. Their model was simple. Take everything the last 50 years had locked in a drawer and ask what it actually was. Psilocybin, MDMA, ketamine, ayahuasca derivatives, each one a separate subsidiary, each one working through clinical trials, all of them sharing the same thesis. The compounds that legislatures had classified alongside heroin were, once properly studied, some of the most promising tools in psychiatry. The pharmaceutical industry was beginning to agree. The FDA was granting designations. The investor money was arriving. In August of 2021, D.E.A launched one more subsidiary. They called it Revixia Life Sciences. Revixia had one compound, salvinorin A, the drug. Nobody had been allowed to study properly. The one the state bans had fenced off. The one the DEA's drawer had been sitting on. The one that had spent 15 years accumulating a reputation built entirely on footage that couldn't show the inside. It had a CEO now, a clinical designation, the compound, a projected trial timeline, a press release. Glenn Short, the CEO of Revixia, explained the compound's particular appeal. To understand why it mattered, it helps to know what the competition looked like. A standard psilocybin therapy session runs 6 to 8 hours. The patient lies on a couch with an eye mask and headphones, supervised, monitored, occasionally in tears, for the better part of a working day. The therapist stays the whole time. The room is booked for the whole time. The session costs several $1,000s. The patient cannot drive afterward. Integration therapy follows over weeks. The whole process requires time, money, and the willingness to spend the better part of a day in a profound and occasionally terrifying rearrangement of your entire sense of self. This works. The clinical data says it works, but the addressable population is people who can afford it, clear a day for it, and tolerate it. Glenn Short had a different pitch. Due to Salvia's short psychedelic effect, he said, it will be an attractive option for those who would like psychedelic treatment, but are unwilling or unable to participate in longer sessions. The shorter experience will allow for more practical administration and monitoring, which may even make it possible to attend psychotherapy sessions on the same day. 6 minutes. The duration that had produced the state bans was now the selling point. The pharmaceutical industry had taken the thing that caused the panic and turned it into the pitch. Florian Brand, the CEO of D.E.A, described Revixia's broader prospects. We believe Revixia has high commercial potential, he said. That sentence, 3 words at the end, is the full arc of this story compressed into a phrase. The compound had been a ceremonial plant in a mountain valley, a specimen in Hoffman's laboratory that refused to reveal itself, a mystery in a graduate student's extraction protocol, a new kind of molecule in a pharmacologist's paper, a legal product in a head shop, a viral video, an emergency, a Schedule I equivalent in 29 states, a subject of congressional testimony, a drug of concern, a draw, a deprioritized draw in a pharmaceutical company that ran out of money before the trials could start, and now, high commercial potential. None of these descriptions were wrong. They were all accurate simultaneously at different moments, depending entirely on who was looking and what they needed it to be. If the trial succeeded, if the compound eventually made it through Phase 1 and Phase 2 and Phase 3 and the FDA approved it, the clinical picture would look like this. A patient sits in a clinic, not a bedroom chair with a camera pointed at them, a prepared room, soft lighting, a trained therapist beside them, not a friend trying not to laugh, vitals monitored, session documented. Before it, a preparation session about what they are trying to address and what they might encounter. After it, integration therapy to work through what came up. 6 minutes. They return. The therapist is there. The attempt to describe the indescribable begins, with someone professional on the other side of it, who's been there for other people before. This is the irony that runs deeper than all the others. The clinical protocol, the preparation, the guide, the careful container, the integration, is the Velada. The Mazatec had built this specific structure because the plant required it, not because a clinical researcher had designed a treatment protocol, because they had learned, over centuries of careful use, that this door opened better with a guide on the other side of it. The ceremony was the harm reduction. The ritual was the therapy. What pharmaceutical development had spent decades dismissing as primitive superstition was, it turned out, the correct delivery system. The pharmaceutical industry arrived at this conclusion 600 years later. They are now filing it under clinical protocol. Whether you find that reassuring or infuriating probably depends on whether you prefer your ironies warm or cold. The trials did not begin in the second half of 2022. D.E.A had gone public on the Nasdaq in June of 2021 at around $15 per share. The pitch had been compelling. The data was real. The unmet need was real. The compounds that decades of prohibition had locked away were genuinely promising. The investors arrived. The capital arrived. The subsidiaries multiplied. Then the market turned. Psychedelic biotech, it turned out, was subject to the same forces as every other sector. Investor enthusiasm runs hot until it doesn't. D.E.A's stock, which had opened at $15 on its first day of trading, had fallen sharply by mid-2022. The company that had been going to transform the treatment of mental health disorders was now taking on $175 million in debt and announcing a strategic prioritization of its pipeline. Strategic prioritization is corporate language for, we cannot do all of this. The compound was moved off the prioritized list, not cancelled, deprioritized. There is something almost elegant about that word in this context. Not dangerous, not banned, not a threat to the children, just not currently fundable, awaiting a more convenient quarter. The same plant that had triggered emergency legislation in 14 states in 6 months, that a Utah representative had filed to schedule after a single television segment, that the D.E.A had been sitting on since 2003, was now in a queue. Which is a different draw from the D.E.A's draw, but it is still a draw. The shepherdess, for her part, had not adjusted her schedule. Meanwhile, in laboratories that had no particular attachment to the original plant, something else was happening. Salvinorin A has a problem as a drug candidate. It works. The mechanism is real, the effects are real, the therapeutic targets are real. But it metabolizes in the body almost immediately. The compound falls apart before it can do anything sustained. For a recreational experience lasting 6 minutes, that's fine. For a pharmaceutical product that needs a predictable, controllable duration, it's a serious obstacle. The solution for medicinal chemists was obvious. Don't use the plant, use the plant structure. Salvinorin A is, among other things, an unusually elegant molecule, compact, specific, with a set of chemical features that interact with the kappa opioid receptor in ways that took a decade to fully map. As a drug, it has problems. As a template it is, in the language of medicinal chemistry, a lead compound, something to build from. By 2024, researchers had synthesized at least 16 structurally distinct analogues based on Salvinorin A's architecture, compounds that retained what worked about the original while addressing what didn't. Longer half-lives, reduced side effects, better pharmacokinetic profiles. Some of them showed anti-addictive effects in animal models without the sedation or dysphoria that had limited the original compound's clinical utility. None of them came from the plant. They came from the structure the plant had revealed. The plant's contribution was to exist, to have spent centuries in a mountain valley doing what plants do, until someone extracted its active compound, mapped its mechanism, and handed the blueprint to chemists who then built something new from it. The Mazatec had tended the original for 600 years. The analogues were being synthesized in laboratories in New Zealand and Germany and the United States by people who had never been to Oaxaca and had no plans to go. One sentence. Salvia divinorum has been used by the Mazatec people in Oaxaca, Mexico, for a variety of illnesses including diarrhea, headaches and rheumatism, as well as for palliative care. Then the release moved on to commercial potential, which was what the release was for. No Mazatec healer was listed as a co-developer of the compound. No Mazatec community held a stake in Revixia. No royalty arrangement existed with the people who'd spent centuries doing the work that pointed directly at the therapeutic mechanism, who had, through careful observation of what happened when the plant was used correctly versus incorrectly, effectively run the world's longest harm reduction trial on its most potent, naturally occurring psychedelic, and published the results as a ceremony. The ceremony was not patentable. The compound derived from the plant was a different question, with a different answer, and the Mazatec had not been invited to participate in it. What they received from 60 years of global interest in their plant, researchers, tourists, forum posts, YouTube videos, state bans, congressional hearings, pharmaceutical subsidiaries, investor presentations, deprioritizations, was, in material terms, nothing. In 2024, a paper was published in the journal Nature Chemistry. The title was The Original Caretakers of Salvinorin A and Recognizing Indigenous Contributions to Science. It argued, specifically and in print in one of the most respected scientific journals in the world, that the Mazatec deserved formal acknowledgement for their role in the discovery and development of the compound, that the knowledge encoded in their ceremonial practice had contributed directly to the scientific understanding of the kappa opioid system, and that this contribution had gone unrecognized for decades. The paper was published in 2024. The ceremonies had been running since roughly the 15th century. The acknowledgement had taken a while to arrive. The veladas continue. The healer goes in the way she has always gone in, slowly, with intention, with a reason prepared in advance, an illness, a question, something that ordinary life hasn't been able to reach. The shepherdess recognizes the difference between someone who arrives with a reason and someone who arrives without one. She has always recognized it. 6 minutes pass. From the inside, this is not what anyone watching the YouTube videos was experiencing. The healer knows where she is. She's been here before, led by the same plant under the same conditions she's always required. She's not surprised by the dissolution. She's not fighting the door. She came in through it deliberately and she knows the way back. She comes back with what was needed. Not always. Not guaranteed. Nothing about the shepherdess is guaranteed. But the ceremony was built around that uncertainty. The preparation, the darkness, the slowness, the guide. Specifically because the people who built it understood that this door opens differently depending on what you bring to it. The Mazatec have a saying about her. They say that La Maria speaks with a quiet voice. Everything the world did with her was loud. What you bring to it has always been the whole point. The ceremony kept going through all of it, through Wasson's article and the tourists and the forum posts and the videos and the bans and the pharmaceutical subsidiary and the deprioritization. It is still going. It will still be going when the next thing arrives. The plant does not negotiate its terms. It never has. Here is what happened from the beginning. A plant stayed in one valley, unable to leave on its own. Someone arrived from outside and took it to the world. The world tried to unlock its secret for 20 years. A graduate student unlocked it. A pharmacologist explained what it meant. The internet found it before the explanation reached anyone who mattered and made something else the point entirely. The bans arrived, the research closed, the opioid crisis built. A pharmaceutical company read all of it and said, high commercial potential. Then the money ran out and the program waited, and the chemist quietly built analogues from the blueprint, and a scientific journal published a paper acknowledging the people who had known what it was all along. The D.E.A. never scheduled it. Not after the congressional bill. Not after 29 states classified it alongside heroin. Not after the videos and the hearings and the grief and the pharmaceutical pipeline and the deprioritization. The 8-factor analysis, opened in 2007, has never been formally closed. The control status has never changed. The drawer is still open. And the Mazatec, who never asked for any of this, who built the velada because the plant required it, who have watched their ceremonial compound become a meme and a Schedule 1 equivalent and a clinical asset designation and a deprioritized item in a Restructured pipeline and a blueprint for synthetic analogues and the subject of a belated acknowledgement in a scientific journal are still there, still tending, still doing it correctly, still receiving nothing